Hey everyone, here are 3 new stories for you to enjoy. If you're new to this channel, I share everything creepy from Japan, so if you're into that kind of stuff, make sure you subscribe. Viewer discretion is advised for the stories Strange Family Death and Gone Boy, as it involves some difficult subjects. As usual, please leave a comment and let me know which story you like the most. Alright, let's get started. This is a creepy story I had when I was small. My dad was a big-time penny pincher. He would pick up all kinds of things for our house from other people's trash. He would always say it was such a waste to throw things away when they could still be used. My entire family weren't very proud of this side of him and told him to stop on numerous occasions because it was embarrassing. He wasn't the type to quit though, so we eventually stopped saying anything at all. He brought home all kinds of things. Sometimes it didn't even make sense because they were outright creepy. And one of those things was that doll. When I got home one day, there was a doll in the bedroom that I shared with my sister. I knew straight away it was something my dad had picked up from someone's trash. Feeling exasperated, I looked down at it. It was those typical Japanese dolls that fit snugly into your arms and would open and close its eyes when you laid it on its side or put it upright. It had long lashes and big brown eyes. Its lips were lightly parted so that you could fit a milk bottle in its mouth, almost looking as if it was about to start speaking. I'm sure it was cute when it was brand new, but its previous owner must have really put it through the ringer because it had doodles drawn all over its smooth white cheeks. When laying it down, one of its eyes could only close halfway. It gave the impression that its face had been run over by something. It was far from pretty and much closer to scary. I had no idea why my dad would bring something like that home. My sister and I have always liked playing with dolls. Our room was full of Rika dolls, which are the Japanese equivalent of Barbies. We also had some French dolls that were inside glass cases, a bunch of stuffed animals and other types of dolls lined up against the wall. Putting this beat-up doll amongst them made it stand out from the rest. The rest of our dolls had been ours from the beginning. We played with them a lot and we were attached to them. But this one was different from the rest. When I slept, I felt like it was looking at me with its half-open eye, and it made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. But I couldn't bring myself to throw something that my dad had given to us, so my sister and I let it sit in the room. It was a while after this doll entered our lives when I experienced something strange. I was falling asleep while lying on my stomach, which is my usual sleeping position, when I heard someone whispering right by my ear. It sounded like a child, and after a couple of seconds, it turned into a giggle. It sounded like a mischievous laughter, like how little children laugh when they're playing a prank on someone. At first, it was just one voice, but that changed into 2, then to 3 different voices. They all sounded like kids and were giggling and whispering to one another. In my drowsy state, I had a fleeting thought that maybe there were kids playing outside, but I knew that that was impossible because it was in the middle of the night. And anyway, the voices sounded like they were right next to me. I couldn't hear what they were actually saying at first, but their words started to get clearer.
Is she sleeping yet? Is she sleeping? Is she?
My eyes were closed, but I could clearly feel the presence hanging over my face as if they were peering in and looking down at me, as if checking to see if I was asleep. One of them said something like,
"Let's check."
It was at that time that my body began to shake uncontrollably and all the hairs on my arms and back stood up and all my muscles tensed up. I'd never felt fear like that. I kept my eyes shut tight. I instinctively knew that if I opened my eyes, something terrifying will happen. I didn't want to see.
Go away, go away, go away, go away.
I desperately began repeating those words in my mind. All this time, I could still feel someone hanging over my face, and I could hear the children whispering amongst themselves. I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was morning. It must have been a bad dream. Feeling relieved, I got up and got ready for school. Unfortunately, that dream wasn't one-off. I began to have the same nightmare over and over again. I would be sleeping in my bed and the voices of several children would begin to sound from somewhere close by. They were laughing and talking, and after a while, I began hearing them running around. They weren't running around the room. Rather, they seemed to be running circles around my pillow. I could hear the pitter-patter of their feet. What started out as 2 or 3 voices began to grow in number. It was a whole bunch of them, and they were all running around, talking and laughing just next to where I laid. It felt like the sounds were coming from a speaker that had been placed next to my head. I was terrified. The voices all belonged to small children. They sounded like they were playing and having a lot of fun, except for a few conversations where they sounded angry towards me. I'd hear the voices right next to my ear asking if I was sleeping, and I would feel multiple presences leaning over and peering into my face. Don't reply. Don't open your eyes. I would experience sleep paralysis and couldn't move a single muscle every time this happened. All I could do was pray for them to go away in my head and fight the fear that I was feeling, hoping I would hurry and wake up. I heard a few of them running around somewhere close by. I could hear their feet scuffling around, but that was impossible because my sister and I shared a bunk bed and I was on the top bunk. It would mean whoever these kids were running around in mid-air. These terrifying dreams continued and I became heavily depressed. It took me a while to realize that the root cause of these dreams was that beat-up doll that my dad brought home. It suddenly hit me one afternoon when I was feeling extremely tired and was starting to drift off to sleep. My consciousness was somewhere between the waking state and the sleeping state when I heard a little girl's voice.
Is she sleeping? Is she sleeping yet? Maybe soon.
It suddenly hit me that this voice belonged to that doll. I don't know why I thought that. I have no explanation for why I felt that way, but I was convinced. Well, to be more precise, it wasn't the doll in itself, but whatever was living inside the doll. Whatever this entity was, that was the thing that was always checking to see whether I was asleep or not. I obviously couldn't talk to anyone about this. They would think I was crazy. But maybe my sister was experiencing something similar. We were sharing a room after all. So I asked her one day about hearing voices in the middle of the night. She just gave me a puzzled look and told me she hasn't heard anything. I was deathly afraid of that doll from that point forward. I wanted to get rid of it, but I was still a child and didn't know what to do. I also felt like I was going crazy because I was obviously the only one who could hear those voices. Why was I the only one? Why did they keep coming to me? I remember a long time ago I saw a ghost. So it makes me wonder whether I have some kind of psychic ability. Maybe whatever entity or entities were present in my home picked up on it and targeted me. A few days later, they came to me again. They all began talking from somewhere close to my pillow, above my head. As usual, I kept my eyes closed, but I think there were about 20 of them. It was so loud that it made me want to cover my ears, to block out all the sound. Out of the 20, there were about 5 of them crowding around my face. They were asking each other whether they thought I was asleep. The one presence I felt that was bending down over my face belonged to that doll. I just knew that it was. And with a child's voice, it said,
No, I think she's awake. She's awake.
The other 4 reacted to this and all began to say that I was actually awake. And then the conversation switched tones as they began to say,
Can we enter? Can we? Come on, let's do it. Let's go in.
It was at this moment that I felt tremendous fear. They were trying to come in and take over my body. I wanted to scream out, but I was paralyzed. I was trembling, but that was the extent to any movement I could make. I felt like this would be the end of me, so I began to chant a mantra that I'd heard on TV a few times. Like I said, I was still small, so I didn't know the entire thing by heart, but I repeated the parts that I knew in my mind. I was desperate. I needed them to go away and leave me alone once and for all. When I woke up, once again it was morning. Even now, as I write this, I wonder whether that entire incident was just a dream. Or maybe I'm still trying to convince myself that it was just a dream because that's a pill that I can swallow as opposed to the other choice. A little while later, we were told that the house we were renting was to be demolished, so my family and I ended up moving into a newly built house. You might be wondering where the doll went. Well, we ended up losing it in the midst of our move. Maybe my mum threw it out when she was sorting through all of our things. Or maybe it's lying in the dark in a closet somewhere in the house. All I can say is that after moving, I never heard those voices again. Maybe that old house had something to do with what I experienced. I still can't explain it to this day. I've kept this a secret for a very, very long time, and being able to write it all down today has lifted a huge weight off my shoulders. So, thank you for reading. I was watching the news yesterday. There's been many incidents involving crimes of passion these days, and whenever I hear stories like that, it reminds me of something from the past. It was a case from when I was still working in the criminal division in the police force. One summer day, we got a call from someone living next door to a house. They said,
There's a smell coming from the neighbor's house. I think it's happened again.
When I heard them say the word again, I knew. I knew straight away which house they were referring to. Everyone living in the same jurisdiction knew about this house. It was infamous for lots of deaths occurring within its walls. Sure, people die all the time. Most deaths that occur outside of hospitals are due to car accidents. But this house was different. I didn't like it because of the high death rate happening inside it. It was way above average. When I got there, I could smell it. The smell of decomposing human bodies. After getting no response from ringing the doorbell and knocking on the door, I had no choice but to break the lock and enter. I discovered 3 bodies. They seemed to have hanged themselves in their respective bedrooms. There were no signs of struggle, and each had a suicide note which looked to be written by each individual lying next to them. All in all, it was quite obvious that no foul play was involved. We all approached the investigation thinking that it was a family suicide, but as we delved into it, we realized how wrong we were. About the remains. The 3 bodies found were that of the husband, wife, and the husband's younger brother. It was determined that all of them had been dead for approximately 10 days. Everything seemed to be in line with a suicide, except for the fact that there were some discrepancies between their suicide notes and what their autopsies revealed. The rope. We went around various stores and discovered that each of them had bought their ropes from different places, measuring about 10 meters in length. Having investigated numerous family suicides before, this was a red flag because usually only one family member goes out and buys the rope for everyone. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and acquaintances. The married couple had bought the house about 2 years before this incident and were living there together. Then 6 months before the deaths, the husband's brother moved in with them because he was unable to support himself after the company he was working for went bankrupt and he lost his job. He was having a hard time finding another job, and so he helped the wife with various things around the house. Their neighbors saw him on numerous occasions doing groceries, doing yard work, cleaning the house entrance, etc. Although none of them had children of their own, their neighbors regarded them as a happy family of 3. The husband's suicide note.
5 years into our marriage, we failed to get pregnant. We even went as far as to change our environment and bought this house. I felt overwhelming pressure from my parents as well as my wife's parents. I didn't tell my wife, but I went to the fertility clinic to get checked. I wanted to get tested once and for all and get some advice from a professional. The result was that I was infertile. I felt so much shame and despair. As I was wondering how I could approach this subject with my wife and our respective parents, too much time passed and I found myself unable to tell them the truth. It was shortly after this that my wife told me that she was pregnant. I couldn't believe it. I thought there must be some kind of mistake. I went back to the fertility clinic to get another test, but the result was the same. No viable seeds. The doctor seemed to have difficulty telling me, but he told me that the chances for me to father a child naturally was 0. I was so confused. I was trying to understand what was going on when my brother's face flashed in my mind's eye. I didn't want to suspect my own brother, but once the idea popped into my head, I couldn't let it go. It was from this point forward that every conversation my wife and my brother had, everything they did together, began to look suspicious and secretive. But I don't have the courage to ask them about it, nor do I have the courage to continue living with these suspicions constantly on my mind. Anyway, if I can't leave any children of my own in this world, then life has no meaning. I've decided to end everything with the secret remaining a secret and without voicing my suspicions. I've made many beautiful memories in this house. Ending my life here will be my last selfish act. Regardless of everything, I wish nothing but happiness for my wife and my brother.
The brother's suicide note.
The 6 months I've lived in this house has been amazing, and I'm so grateful to my brother and his wife for taking me in. But there's something that I have to apologize to my brother for, that I have to beg forgiveness for, even if it's with my life. It was 3 months ago. When my brother was out at work, his wife and I had relations. It might sound like an excuse. Neither of us really initiated it. Our eyes naturally met, our hands touched, and before we knew it, we were both pulled into it. She was depressed because she couldn't get pregnant, and I was frustrated because I couldn't find work. We were both suffering in our own way, and we went forward with it without thinking about the consequences. It only happened that one time. My heart has been so heavy with guilt and shame, and a few days ago, my brother's wife told me she was pregnant. I instantly felt anxious, and when she was alone, I pressed her to tell me who she thought the father could be, but she never answered me. Yesterday, I heard her crying loudly in her bedroom. I believe all of this is happening because of our infidelity. I know that killing myself isn't going to bring forgiveness, but I'm not strong enough to continue living knowing how I've betrayed my own brother. I can't continue lying to him. So, I've decided to end my life in this house where I've had a wonderful 6 months with them. I'm so sorry that I've become a burden and an inconvenience for you both. I wish nothing but happiness for you.
The wife's suicide note.
There's something I need to apologize to you about, my dear husband. I've actually been having an affair with another man for the past few years, and in all honesty, my heart belonged to that man for a while. We tried so hard to have a baby, you and I, but we couldn't get pregnant. I was sad and depressed, and this man was so understanding and spoke kind words to me. I fell in love with him, and he told me he wanted to be with me. I believed in what we had. And then my period stopped coming, and I knew I was pregnant. I told this man straight away that I was pregnant with his child. He told me there was nothing he wanted more than to be with me right away, but he said I should have the baby in a stable environment. He told me I had to divorce you first, and that him and I will get married after that got finalized. I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to begin a new life with him as his wife and as a mother. My head and heart were full of joy, until he disappeared. I haven't been able to get in touch with him for the past few days now. I went to his house, but he's moved away. I contacted his workplace, but was told that no one by that name worked there. It was then that I realized that I'd been played. I was used and thrown away like some dog's old chew toy. I cried every single day. Now I have nothing but anger and resentment towards this man. I wish I could have said all of this to you face to face, to apologize and tell you the truth, but I don't have enough courage to do so. I'm so sorry you had to find all of this out through a letter. I have nowhere else to go, so I've decided to end my life in this house. I'm sorry. I hope you continue to live a great life and that you and your brother continue to support each other.
Autopsy results. Number 1. It was determined that the wife was never pregnant. She had also never gone to any hospital or maternity clinics to get tested, nor for any follow-up checkups if she was indeed pregnant. From the suicide letters, it's highly probable that the wife was faking her pregnancy. Number 2. Although the order in which they died could not be determined, they had all committed suicide by themselves in their own time. This means that it wasn't a family suicide. Number 3. Each letter seemed to have been written by their own hand. However, there were some similarities in the way they phrased some of their sentences. It almost seemed like they had all referenced something, but upon searching the books in their house and their internet search histories, nothing that suggested that was found. This happened 10 years ago, and to this day, I still wonder who killed who. It's in the wilderness. That was my first thought when I got to the neighborhood. The land was developed about 10 years ago, but the houses were few and wide in between. Amongst them stood a house on a property that was much bigger than the rest. It had 2 stories, was a Western-style home, and boasted a big garden, which is very rare in Japan. It was surrounded by a wall that was about 2 meters in height, with trimmed ivy growing along it. It was interrupted by a wide iron gate.
"This is it,"
said the real estate agent, pointing to the house right next to this huge house. It was a much smaller 2-story house that almost looked like those prefabricated homes sitting in construction sites. It had cream-colored walls, a square roof, and in the setting sun looked orange. I was still a uni student, so a house like this was still pretty damn nice. "This place was used as a housing for our employees, so it comes with basic furniture," said the real estate agent as he opened the brown metallic gate. "Why isn't anyone living in it?" I asked. The agent scratched his head and replied a bit hesitantly. "Well, this place is a bit inconvenient if you don't have a car. There's quite a distance to the nearest train station too, so it's tough even if you own a bicycle, not to mention it's quite hilly around here. The bus we just took comes by only once an hour, so please be careful when you have to go to class. The bus comes at 1/4 every hour. I assume it'll start running more frequently if more people moved into the neighborhood, but that isn't the case right now. So yeah, that's why this house isn't being used by our company right now." He put the key into the door, turned it, and opened the door. There was a small shoe cabinet that came up to the waist, and I could see that all the walls were painted a boring white. We're so sorry for asking you to stay here." "Oh, that's okay. It's only for a week anyway," I said as I looked around and studied the rest of the house. This spring, I was accepted into a university. It was far from home, so I found an apartment close to the campus, and that was where I was supposed to start my uni life. However, something happened and the person who was supposed to move out of the unit got delayed an extra week. I assume it was a mistake on behalf of the real estate. Having only been told this the day before and classes starting the next day, I had no choice but to go along with it. The gas and electricity have been turned on and the whole house was cleaned this afternoon, and we'll cover all of your transportation costs. The real estate agent gave me an extremely low bow to express their apologies and handed me the keys. After he left, I let myself into the house. I put my bag, which was packed with enough things for the week, and began to explore. There was a couch and a TV in the living room and a laundry machine just outside the bathroom. There were cups and plates, cutlery, a fridge and a rice cooker in the kitchen. All the windows had curtains on them. I was impressed. They all looked fairly new and clean. There were 3 bedrooms up on the second floor. There was a pipe bed in one of the rooms with a clean mattress on it. I almost felt like living here after seeing all this, but the transportation was a big issue and I knew it wouldn't work out in the long run. I liked that house, at least in the beginning. Considering the next day was the first day of uni, I decided to go to bed shortly after 11 p.m. I was using the room with the bed upstairs. As I was nodding off, I heard a car honk once outside, which jarred me awake. It honked once again, very lightly, just outside my window. Next, I heard the heavy gates opening, closing, a few people talking outside, then the car door closing. My window was facing the big house next door, so it must have been the people living there. I remember thinking how rude it was to honk their car in the middle of the night and hoped it was just a one-off thing. I didn't bother looking out the window, rolled over, and tried to go back to sleep. Just as I was about to fall asleep for the second time, I heard another car engine and heard it stop right outside, probably by the neighbor's gates again. I heard the car door closing and the gates opening. Someone began talking, but the voices suddenly got fainter and I could hear the door to the house closing. This time I opened my eyes, got up and peeked out the curtains. The moonlight immediately shone into the dark room. Is it a full moon tonight? I wondered. I couldn't see anything next door until another car came down the road. It stopped next to the gates, began moving back and forth, trying to turn the car's rear towards the garage. Whoever was driving was having a hard time orienting their car. I continued to observe what was going on. It was definitely a full moon, but I couldn't see the neighbor's garage or their doorway from where I stood. The only thing I could see was a faint light seeping through some trees that were acting as their wall along the perimeter facing my window. The person must have finally parked their car because I heard its door closing. I heard the metallic sound of the gates and more conversation. This time I could hear them a bit clearer. They sounded like they were in their 40s or 50s. It went silent after I heard the entrance door close. I opened the window and peered out. I couldn't see any other houses other than ours. It was silent and pitch black other than the moonlight. Feeling a little unsettled, I closed the window and walked back to bed. I tried to go back to sleep, but after tossing and turning for an hour, I gave up. I remembered there was a convenience store about a 5 to 6 minute walk from the house, so I decided to go there. When I walked outside, my eyes naturally went towards the neighbor's garage. It was a simple open type with concrete floors and aluminium beams with a roof. There was a lamppost right next to it, so the cars were brightly illuminated and I saw 4 of them parked there. I was pretty sure there was only one red car parked there when I had arrived earlier that day. I was right. There was one red sports car parked in the furthest space. My attention was caught by something else. It was the white sedan parked closest to me. There was a black scratch about 10 centimeters or 4 inches in width along the left side of it, Maybe it was a car that was having a hard time parking just before. I walked over to get a better look when I saw something else. There was one word written just below the scratch. It was small and thin, as if whoever did it used a nail. It said in English, in all caps, "Help." Did a passerby vandalize the car? I wondered. It made me feel uneasy, so I hurried off towards the convenience store. When I got there, I perused some of the magazines, bought a drink, and followed the same road back home. When I got to the neighbor's house, there were only 2 cars left, the red sports car and the white sedan. Did the other 2 cars go out again? It was already a little past 1 a.m. I looked at the white car again and I did a double take. The word help that I'd seen earlier was gone. The big black scratch was still there, so it was definitely the same car. As I was trying to search for the word, I heard the door to the house open and I jumped. I quickly trotted out of their vicinity back towards my house and overheard their conversation as I did so. The kid from before, how come he wasn't here tonight? Just before I opened the gates to my house, I glanced over. There was a man who looked to be in his 40s wearing a suit coming out of the property next door. I could see another man still standing inside. He was leaning against the gate, looked around 30 years old, had a shaved head and a flashy shirt. He looked like the typical Yakuza, and I heard him reply, "Oh, him. He has a cold." "Oh, that's too bad," said the man in the suit. He turned and saw me looking at them. Our eyes met. For some reason, I saw a bit of panic flash in the man's eyes, and he quickly turned away and climbed into his white sedan. Well, that made things clear. I was nonchalantly thinking to myself that he was just a visitor as I watched his taillights disappear into the night, when I felt someone staring at me. I looked over to see the scary-looking man still standing at his gate. He was glaring at me. I freaked out and tensed up. The man slowly closed his gates, keeping his eyes on me until it was completely shut. After he disappeared, I let out a sigh of relief and at the same time wondered why I had to be the one getting scared. Wanting to know who that man was, I looked for his name tag in front of his house, but there was nothing. A lot of questions began welling up regarding this house. I eventually fell asleep but woke up again, this time because I was cold. I was using a pretty thick blanket, but I felt chilled to the bone. Did this area get this cold even in spring? I got up once again in the dark and looked at the time on my phone. It was now 2 a.m. I walked over to the closet and opened it, hoping to see another set of blankets. Lucky for me, there was another set folded up neatly inside. I took it back to bed, laid it on top of my other one, and snuggled up inside. But I still felt cold. Unbelievably cold. That was when I realized that I had forgotten to close the curtains after closing my window earlier. There was a gap of about 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and I could see something glinting outside. I didn't know what it was, and I just stared at it. I stopped breathing. There was a weird, round silhouette on the other side of my window. It was a person's head. I could only see it from above its eyes. The glint was coming from the whites of one eye that was peering in through the gap. Was it a burglar? After seeing what happened next, I was hoping that it was. The silhouette slowly began to move upwards. It wasn't like they were climbing up. It was a smooth movement, as if they were floating higher into the air. It had a fringe that had a whitish glow to it. Its skin looked grey and the clothes were disheveled and torn in places. The only light available was the moonlight, but I could clearly see that the silhouette was slightly transparent. I knew right then that it wasn't human. It continued to move up until I could see its entire length. The window was about 1 meter or 3 feet in height, and the silhouette fit neatly into it from head to toe. It was very short, like a small child. It stopped for a few seconds, then it started to move back down again. I couldn't let out a sound as I just stared at its one eye that I could see from the gap in the curtain. Its bluish pupil was out of focus, and yet it was looking at me at the same time. It wasn't alive. Once its eyes got to the bottom windowsill, it stopped again for a few seconds, then began moving up again. It continued to go up and down and sometimes seemed to bring its head closer, rubbing its face against the window as if checking for something. Was it trying to get in? As soon as that thought sprung into my mind, the fear and terror within me exploded. I screamed so loud and tried to run away, but I could only flail my arms around. I couldn't get any other muscles to work. I was wide awake, so it wasn't sleep paralysis. I was so terrified that my muscles were literally not responding. I pulled the bed covers over my head and just trembled in fear, shouting at it to not come in. I must have fallen asleep at some point. When I woke up, it was morning. Despite the fact that I was freezing during the night, I was drenched in sweat. Was that all a bad dream? The bright sunlight almost made me believe that it was. I went to uni and out to dinner with some of my classmates that night. I tried to stay out as late as possible because I was scared to go back to that house. I didn't want to stay in it any longer than was necessary and took the very last bus home. It was already close to midnight. I regretted that decision right away because entering the house in the pitch dark was even scarier. After walking for about 6 minutes, the house came into view with its square roof. I took a deep breath as I opened the door, ran inside and turned on all the lights as quickly as I could. I got to the bottom of the stairs, looked up and hesitated. But I had to go up, so I ran up the stairs, did my best not to look at anything else as I practically dove into the bedroom. I turned on the lights and ran to the bed, grabbed the pillow and the blanket, and was about to head back to the living room downstairs when my foot got caught in the blanket and I fell forward. I caught myself against the wall, and although I dropped the pillow, I saved myself from falling flat on my face. As I recovered, my heart racing, I saw that I was standing right next to the window. The curtain touched my face and I let out a yelp and jumped back. I stood there staring at the curtain until it stopped swaying, plucked up my courage, and reached out. Could that thing be outside again tonight? I yanked it open. There was nothing. I let out the biggest sigh of relief, but that was cut short when I noticed that the window was dirty. There were white smudges all over the window. Each smudge was thin and long, almost like someone had caked their hair with white paint and had rubbed their head all over the window. I touched it. My fingers remained clean, so it was the outside that was dirty. I tried to think back on the previous night when I opened the window. I'm pretty sure the window was clean at that point. Could a bird have done this? I was trying to come up with a plausible explanation when I saw something. It was towards the bottom of the window. There was a word written there, in English, in all caps. The words were mirrored, but I could read it. It said, "Help." I stood there staring at it and thinking for a while. And when I realized what this meant, I ran out of my room as if my life depended on it, my heart racing so fast and hard I thought it might come out of my mouth. Someone had written "help" from outside the window. That was why it was mirrored. As soon as I got down to the living room, I closed the door and threw the blanket onto the lounge. I had forgotten to pick the pillow up in my panicked state. Didn't matter though, because there were 4 cushions on the lounge and I could use that instead. I vowed I would never go upstairs again for the remainder of my stay in that house. Feeling scared and paranoid that I might see something again, I took the quickest shower, and by the time I lay down on the lounge, it was 1:30 in the morning. I wasn't stupid enough to turn off the lights, so I shut my eyes in the bright living room and tried to go to sleep. I could hear cars outside again. I could hear people talking, the gates in the door to the neighbor's house opening and closing. It happened a few times, just like the previous night. Who were all these visitors, and what in the world were they doing? The sounds kept me awake, but I was glad to hear other people coming and going. It didn't make me feel so alone. I eventually fell asleep, albeit with a nagging feeling tugging at me. Where am I? I was standing in a dark place. There weren't any windows and there were no lights. But from some distance away, there was a thin horizontal ray of light. Was it coming from a door? Yes. Yes, it was. The light was seeping out from the crack at the bottom. Now that my eyes were starting to get used to the dark, I could see a faint outline of a door. Then I felt someone looking at me. I turned around to see a small child standing a few feet away. Although it was dark, I could see all of his details. He had whitish hair, or maybe it was blonde. He was Caucasian and very thin, maybe around 7 or 8 years old. His pale blue eyes looked familiar. His t-shirt, shorts, and his bare feet were dirty. He seemed to want to say something, but I couldn't understand. Was it because he wasn't speaking in Japanese, or was it some other reason? I felt like I was floating somewhere between the real world and a dream. The boy was moving his mouth, desperately trying to tell me something. He crumbled down to his knees and started hitting the floor with his open hands, and I saw a few plants growing from the ground. Was I outside or inside a room? I felt like I was surrounded by walls, but if there are plants growing, maybe I'm outside. I looked down at my feet and saw that there was earth beneath my feet. There was grass growing. It was swaying in the wind, although there was no wind blowing. Paying closer attention to it, I could see that it was moving in unnatural directions. It was wriggling and bending around. It didn't look like grass at all. They were round and thicker than regular grass. They were fingers. Looking around me again, I could see several little hands and fingers poking out of the ground. Just then, someone opened the door. I turned back around again and saw that there was a window on the other side of the door. Outside the window stood a house with a white roof. It was surrounded by lush trees and the sky was bright blue. I suddenly woke up from the dream. I knew instantly why I had woken up. Someone was knocking on the window non-stop. It was faint, but it was incessant. The lights were still on, and I looked at the clock hanging on the wall above the TV. It was 2 a.m. I listened harder. The knocking sounded like it was coming from upstairs. I wanted to ignore it, but it suddenly became louder, and I imagined the shadow I saw the previous night banging its head against the window. The sound kept getting louder to the point where you could hear the entire window vibrating. It sounded like it would break at any moment. There was no way in hell I was going to go upstairs to check. Instead, I ran outside because I felt like being outdoors would be safer. Once there, I looked up at the bedroom window. The light was still on in the room, and there was a small ball of mist just outside. The moonlight was shining on it, and it turned towards me. Within a blink of an eye, its whitish blondish hair that covered part of his face, its pale grey skin and light blue eyes were right in front of my face. Its bare feet were hanging off the ground. I screamed and tried to run back into the house, but the shadow blocked my way and I had no choice but to run elsewhere. No matter which direction I tried to run, it would block my way until my only choice was to run to the neighbor's house. I was in full flight mode and opened the heavy iron gate and ran up to the entrance. I tried to turn the knob, but it was locked. I was jiggling it around like you see in those silly horror movies when I heard a click from the other side and the door gave way. I almost tumbled in head first, and what jumped into my sights was far from what anyone would have expected. There were no other shoes at the entrance, let alone a shoe cabinet. The person who had supposedly unlocked the door was nowhere to be seen, and all the floors were lined with a red carpet. It was like a hotel entrance where people walk in without taking their shoes off. It was dead silent and seemed like nobody was home. There was a long hallway stretching out in front, illuminated by 3 square light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. There were multiple doors on either side of the hall, and the closest one to me was the only one that was open. from it, the Yakuza-looking man from the night before came storming out with a crazed expression. At this point, I didn't care who he was as I managed to ask him for help. "How the hell did you get in here? The door was locked!" he yelled. Obviously, someone had opened it for me, but I had no time to explain. I was still running for my life. Could he not see the thing behind me? The man was irate. He grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and continued yelling, asking whether I knew what was going on in these walls. It was then that I felt something ice cold attach itself to my entire back. I saw strands of light blonde hair hang over my eyes. I let out a scream, pushed the man aside, and ran down the hallway. I came to a dead end. There was a wall in front of me and to my right, and a window to my left. Naturally, my eyes looked out the window. I saw the second floor of my house. I could barely see the window to the bedroom that I was sleeping in, and I knew instantly that it was the same view I saw in my dreams, but the angle was a bit off. In my dream, I could see a lot more of the house, which signified that I was looking at it from a more elevated perspective, which meant I looked at the last door along the right wall and reached out to open it. I turned the knob and I heard the click of the door as it opened. The man was catching up, yelling at me to stop, and when he saw the door open, he seemed shocked, his eyes widening. He stopped where he was and was mumbling something about how it was impossible for me to open that door because it was always locked. I ignored him and opened it completely. In the darkness, I saw a short flight of stairs going up and another door at the landing above. The lights were off. For some reason, I wasn't scared anymore. I felt like it was my duty to see what was up there, so I ran up and opened the second door. It creaked heavily as I did so. Just enough light from the hallway illuminated the inside of the room. There were no furnitures, and most of the floorboards had been ripped out. I could see a few thin white objects scattered about. I walked in to take a closer look. There were bone fragments. They were so small, and there were so many of them that they had to belong to multiple children. All the fear that I'd felt up to a few minutes ago boiled into anger. I yelled out and asked how many the man had killed. I turned around to see that the man had followed me into the room. It was my turn to grab him as I yelled into his face. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. There should only be that one foreign boy." I yelled at him to dig the floor up to prove me wrong. There were way too many bones to have come from one small boy. I was shaking, my adrenaline in overdrive. All the blood ran from the man's face and he went pale. I saw 3 men poke their heads into the door from the hallway. They must have heard the commotion and come to see what was going on. And I don't know when, but the shadow that had been chasing me up to this point had disappeared. I looked out the window in the room. I could see the roof of my house and the sky above it. It was at that exact same angle that I'd seen in my dreams. I don't know why I couldn't figure it out earlier. The apparition of that child never entered my house. He was trying to get my attention so that I could save him. He was asking for my help all this time. The police got involved and everything came to light. This house was used for sex trafficking, not of adults, but of young children. It didn't matter if they were male or female as long as they were young. They were kept locked in that room, and once they got too old, they were killed and buried in the garden. The children were basically brought in shortly after they were born, raised elsewhere until a certain age, and then sent to this house of horrors. None of them were kidnapped. It was worse than that. Their own parents sold them for money, which meant none of these children were registered, nor had any citizenship to any country. They basically didn't exist. 8 children were rescued from the house, but it was next to impossible to identify them. The extent of this organized crime was something only the Yakuza could pull off. The man in his 30s who was chasing me around was apparently a lower-level man within the organization who had only recently been appointed to that position. He wasn't involved in the slayings of the children or in burying them. The police are still in the midst of investigating, going through the list of their clientele and everything else. I also heard that the house was apparently built exactly for this purpose, with every room being soundproofed. So this entire ring had been carefully planned and executed. After this incident, I never went back to that house anymore. I stayed with a friend that I made at uni for the few days left before I could move into my own apartment. I didn't make that decision out of fear. It came more from a feeling of pain, disgust, and regret. To know that so many young children were going through unspeakable things right next door. Knowing that they had no identity and no one looking for them after they were killed. It was too much for me to bear. A total of 16 bodies were discovered in that house. Most of them were of Asian descent, but just one was a Caucasian. Upon examination, it was discovered that he had only died a few days prior. I still wonder sometimes, if I had come to that house a few days earlier, would that little boy still be alive today? I don't know why I was the only one who was able to see him. Maybe it's because there was no one else around that he could ask for help. I only know one thing for sure. The blue sky that I saw above the rooftop in my dreams was the purest and most beautiful shade of blue I'd ever seen.